Hey everyone, it's great to have you here, and I'll just kick off a little bit background on myself before we get into it. This is a pretty broad topic, so we won't touch too deep of a dive into a lot of things, but just want to get the broad strokes. But I'm a performance psychology consultant finishing up my PhD to legally become a performance psychologist in the state of Pennsylvania. I also have a second master's degree in learning technologies, and I've been a volleyball coach for 30 years now. I currently coach at a Division III women's volleyball program. So a lot of this comes from a combination of my work in the performance psychology side and then also the work on the coaching side, whether it is from youth. I've coached everything from 10U up to elite and pro teams. And I noticed that one of the things that happens a lot is we don't have a lot of time that we spend on culture, but yet culture is typically what breaks down when we need it the most. So I kind of wanted, when I was approached about doing this webinar, and had my choice of topics, I really wanted to touch on culture, even though knowing that within a 1 hour webinar, we're not really going to be able to dive too much into it, but hopefully it'll spark some conversations and some thoughts and get some feedback and questions from you guys, and we can go from there. So I will start by sharing the screen. I will do my best not to make this a completely boring PowerPoint slideshow for everyone. I have all my contact information on the screen. I'll also put it in the chat for you then at the end. Feel free to reach out at any time with any questions, or if you wanted a little bit more information on kind of what we talk about today, or how something might pertain to your specific sport or area that you're working on, or how we can modify it. I love talking about this. I love reaching out with all coaches of different levels and different sports. And that's probably the favorite part of my job, is working with other coaches. So again, feel free to reach out. So what I want to start with is the difference between team culture and a functional culture. And a lot of times when we talk about team culture, one of the first things that comes to mind is, well, we're going to do rope courses, or we want to do some kind of bonding exercise that is going to help my team and that culture grow. And while those things are great and they are a component of it, I think our biggest problems and our biggest breakdowns is that we are involved in a much bigger culture. And a lot of times we don't take the time to pause and stop and look at how that might affect us. So we're going to look at the bigger picture of culture, and not just specifically, hey, how can I make my U14 softball team a better team? We want to talk about bigger culture issues and surroundings around that team that will affect the team that you may not think too much about. And when we look at functional culture, and what I mean by functional culture is not just going through and saying, hey, this is our culture and this is what we stand for, but actually, how does our culture drive us? How does it make us successful? Or on the flip side, how does our culture make us non-successful? Because one of the things is, whether we train it or not, we develop a culture, or we are part of a culture. So if you think, well, I don't need to really train it, you're still going to have a culture around your program or your team. So there's some things that we need to think about. One of the biggest things I think we need to look at, and that's why it's the base and the bottom of the pyramid, is the socioeconomics of our teams. Years ago, it wasn't as much of a deal because most of our team, we pulled from more local resources. Our baseball teams, our volleyball teams, our basketball teams were all very localized. And one of the things with the local situation is that a lot of the people have the same beliefs, they have the same values, so there weren't a lot of conflicts. But now, as youth sports in particular, and even college sports have grown so much, we're pulling in and bringing a lot more different socioeconomic backgrounds. And a lot of times we don't take the time to stop and think about that. We kind of get in our bubble. We're coaching at this college, or we're coaching in this town, and we're used to the people that surround us, and we forget that we're typically now bringing people in from out of town and from different ways. So we want to look at the social economic aspects. Next, we want to move up the pyramid, and we need to look at our philosophies. And again, we may have philosophies as coaches, but Our players have their own philosophies, whether they know it or not. They know what's important to them, what they're looking for. And if we don't take the time to look at that as coaches, we don't know how that may affect our team or our program philosophies. So that's something that we want to look at. Then we move into the environment. What are the rules, the visions, the goals that we have as a program or a team that may also fit the culture or cause conflict in the culture? And we'll dive into each of these levels a little bit more. And then we move into the training. And this is a big one. We can talk and say all we want about our cultures and our beliefs and our philosophies, but do we actually train that way when we're on the pitch or in the gym or in the swimming pool or on the court? Or what we're doing action-wise and practice-wise and even competition-wise backing up what we're saying when we're talking about our culture and our environment in our program. And then lastly, it's a big one for me. There's a great quote that if we don't have reflection on what we're doing, we're not learning. So if we don't take the time to stop and look back at how we're training, what our culture looks like, and we just keep plugging along and moving along year after year, we're not really learning from that. We're not taking the time to stop and see where we might be able to improve in those situations. So let's break down each of these levels. And I'll provide the printout of the PDF too, so you guys don't have to spend a lot of time writing, but I mean, obviously feel free. When we talk about traditional socioeconomic factors, whether it's in sport or in life or in government, typically the big ones are occupation, education, income, wealth, and location. Those are, what really makes up a base of your company or your employees. When we talk about it in the sports world, we have those same traditional factors, but then we also add in there, what's the role of that player or even that staff member on the team? And also, what's their training level? How much experience are they bringing into your program? So when we talk about the socioeconomics in a sports team, that's what we're looking at. What is the role of each person involved? And again, that can be staff, that can be players, that can even be other stakeholders like parents or administration. And what training level do they bring in? Are they coming into your program with a vast wealth of knowledge that's going to help your program, or are they new? And both of those types of people bring a ton of value to your program or your team, but you need to know where they're at so you know how to use their advice or how you can incorporate their advice correctly into what you're doing. And while we don't like to think about it too much, income and wealth do affect us in the sports world a lot. We have players that maybe have to have a second job and they're coming from school and going to a job and then coming from a job to practice. That's something that we as coaches need to know, because we might get on kids because they're running late and they're always missing practices. But what we don't realize is maybe they're at home taking care of the little brother because it's a single parent family. And that's why they're running late. And it's really hard to think about, well, how do you get upset at a kid that's really supporting their family and doing something like that? And maybe we give them a little bit more grace and we even try to help them out. That all goes into our culture under the socioeconomic side. Maybe they can't afford to go on these big national trips that a lot of youth clubs are now doing. And we kind of get upset about that, but we don't realize the burden and the tax that puts on families. And then that grows into some of the problems that we have with parents, because they're stressed out in tax because they're spending all this money, maybe their kid's not playing, but we never stopped and kind of took the thought of the social economic factors of what they were bringing in there when we were making the schedule or deciding to bring that kid on our team, and it has a huge effect. And then the other one is location. Again, years ago when we didn't have the internet, we couldn't scout and we couldn't, look all over the world for these players. Most of the players that we pulled from were local. Every once in a while, you get a kid that would maybe travel an hour to come to your practice to play for an elite team or a top team. But now that's commonplace. The average travel time for kids in youth sports is now over an hour. While that brings talent in, that also brings in different actions, different thoughts, different philosophies that those players have. It's, again, not like it used to be years ago where the town next to you typically had the same values, the same beliefs, the same ethics, and everything that you have. Now it's much more diverse. but we get so used to working in our bubble, we don't think about, well, this is where my club is, or this is where my team is based. So this is probably what they're thinking or what they have to deal with. So that's how the social economic factor works into it. And after we go through each of the levels and define them, we'll talk a little bit about how we incorporate that, how we work on it. And then we'll kind of end with some bullet points on how we can, as a whole, work on the culture and incorporate what we're looking at. Philosophy is an interesting one to me because I do a lot of work with coaching organizations in multiple sports. And one of the ones that I usually get asked to do, and probably one of the favorite ones that I like to do, is working on coaching philosophies. Whether you want to be a coach as a professional, or maybe you just became a coach because your kid's team didn't have a coach and you had to fill in, you should still have a philosophy. What drives you, what's going to help you make those decisions. And I think most coaches, probably even on this call, have gone through some sort of philosophy. What's your coaching mantra? What do you stand for? What's your vision as a coach? But one of the things that we often don't think about is everything that we're involved with has its own philosophy, whether it's our governing bodies, whether it's USA Lacrosse or USA Volleyball, they all have their philosophies and what they're about. Then if you're a team in a larger club, your club as a whole has its own philosophy. Your team as a group has its philosophy. You as a coach, your players have a philosophy, and obviously your parents have a philosophy as well. And I'm not saying that we have to cater to all of them, but when you have situations or problems that are arising, it's good to know what those philosophies are. Is what you value as a coach in line with your governing body's vision, or even your organization's vision? Or more importantly, is what you want out of the team as a coach and your philosophy the same as what your players want? And a great example that we have is if you have a team that's a quote unquote national traveling team, what do you do with players that are really just playing because they want to be there with their friends? They want to stay in shape. Maybe it's their second sport, but the other half of your team is all in. They want to try and win a national championship. And sometimes that's a philosophy that can cause conflict if you don't know about it, if you don't know going in. Well, I'm joining this team, but I need you to know that it's more about hanging out with my friends and getting quality reps than it is about chasing a national championship. Or, yep, I'm all in. I want to win a national championship. We'll do whatever it takes. It's good to know those philosophies going in, but a lot of times we don't take the time to stop and think about, what do our players want? What do our players value? But more importantly, what do I as a coach value? Because there just might be a big conflict where I can't put that time into this team. We need to find a different coach because this team has higher aspirations than what I'm willing to coach. But a lot of times we just put coaches where they think they want, or they want to be on the top teams because it's more prestigious. But then there's conflicts and the culture actually becomes a little bit toxic and becomes an issue because these things aren't in alignment. Now, I'm not saying that everything will always be in alignment, but again, it's easier to know how to diffuse a situation or work out a situation if we know where those philosophies are and what's going on. When it comes to a coaching philosophy or even an organizational philosophy, when I was running a club, this is something that I visit every year. Every year before my season, and I'm a volleyball coach, so we start in August. Every year around June or July, I sit down and look at my current coaching philosophy and I tweak it. Some years it may be removing a complete thought or a paragraph and putting something new in. Other years it might just be a sentence or adding something, here or there. But I go over my philosophy because that's what's going to guide me. When things are tough or things are challenging or I have a problem, my philosophy should guide me and it should make that problem a little bit easier. And that's how we go through it with this part of the pyramid. Is we want to get the philosophy so we know that we're acting with our organization's philosophy, our governing body's philosophy, and all the major stakeholders at least know where we stand on issues. Then we move into the next chunk, which is the environment. And this is big, right? Because we put all those philosophies out. We have all those rules. We have everything that we say at the parent meeting before the beginning of the season. But then once we get into the gym, are we actually following that? Are we actually giving the goods that we sold to the parents and the players at the beginning of the season when we're actually doing the physical work in the gym? And a lot of times we get flustered. We have the best intentions in the world. We go out to our first event and all of a sudden we kind of get punched in the face, and maybe it's not the best tournament that we've ever had, or it's not the best game or the best match that we've ever had. And we throw our whole practice plan or what we want to do out the window because we kind of freak out a little bit. And this is where we have to be careful. We want to make sure that our rules, our policies, our goals, our planning, even our safety all line up with what our philosophies are. Because the last thing that you want to do is say that you're about this, say that you're about equal playing time. Regardless of the situation, everyone is going to play the exact same minutes or the exact same points. But then when you have a chance to win a championship or a medal, all of a sudden you change that because you want that championship. You can see where that's going to cause a problem with your culture because that's not what you sold in the beginning. That's not what you've been preaching. And the same goes with practice. We're going to work hard. I want to hold everyone accountable. We need to have commitment. But then as a coach, maybe you're showing up late, you're showing up unprepared. Maybe you have, team members that are showing up unprepared or late, and you're not holding them accountable. That's starting to make your culture shift, whether you like it or not, because you're preaching one thing and saying one thing, but then you're producing something else. And that's going to cause a conflict because it's just a mess of communication. The second to last step we look at is actually how we train. What's the technical and the tactical ways that we train? Are we laying the plans out? And I will tell you, one of the biggest things that I think has helped me as a coach is sharing what we're doing. Every day when we walk in on the whiteboard is exactly what we're doing that day for practice. It's not a secret. The players know exactly what we're going to work for. And there's a lot of reasons for that aren't completely culture involved, like motivation, tracking players' progress and those types of things. But from a culture standpoint, they know what we're working on and they know what our goals are. And then the same way with our training. Hopefully most of us are not punishment based. You miss a skill, you miss a shot, you miss an at bat, and you do some push-ups or you run some lap. If we say that we're a positive coach and we don't believe in punishment, then there's certain times that we're throwing out punishments. Again, that's going to affect our culture and how we have to work through our culture. We also need to talk about feed forward and feedback. And again, that was actually going to be one of the topics. If I didn't do culture, I was going to do feedback versus feed forward. So I'll just touch on it here briefly, but I've switched most of my modeling to feed forward. Instead of waiting to see my players mess up and catch them when they're doing it wrong, I explain to them, this is what I want before they do a rep. Hey, Jenny, this is the footwork that I want. This is how I want you to swing. And this is where I want you to put the ball. Now go do it. And we find that they have better success because they know exactly what we're looking for, but they're also motivated because they feel like, we're giving them that trust that they can do it. Of course, we do have sessions of feedback when things go wrong, and we do that quick feedback. Hey, this is kind of went wrong. But we find that if we give them feed forward before they even attempt it or they even try anything, the success rate is typically higher, and it also sticks in their mind a little bit longer. So if you can think about one thing that you want to change from the training side of how you coach, look at how you're giving and receiving feedback versus are you giving feed forward? And then the other thing from training is we have to have continued learning. And this goes from everyone, from coaches to players to parents. And I'm just going to kind of stick this in here about the parents, because I know there's always this tension between coaches and parents and administration and parents. And the problem is we're kind of all at fault and we all need to do a better job. And one of the biggest things is we don't educate our parents enough. We assume that they've acquired this knowledge over time. You assume that a coach of a 16U basketball player knows enough now about basketball because their son or daughter has been playing since they were 8U. But the truth of the matter is most of them don't. And they're just trying to pull information. And it's just like anything else in the world. They're Googling it. They're using TikTok. They're using all the social media, but they're not getting a true sense. So we need to look at how can we educate our stakeholders? How do we have more education for our coaches? How do we have more education for our players? How do we have more education for our parents? Again, if we can educate our parents, I think that would solve a lot of problems that we run into as coaches. We just assume that they have this knowledge or understand, and that's part of the problem that we run into. And then the last part is reflection. We meet and huddle about everything from stats, how this game went, but how many times have you stopped to talk about what's our culture like in our gym? How are we doing with the culture piece? Are we having issues? Are we having things that we need to look at? Do we have front facing versus an internal image problem? Meaning, do we have problems where what the public or other teams or other players or parents have, this view of us versus what's actually going on in our gym? And then the other thing I'd like you to think about is, how do you react as a coach to behavior versus action problems? And what I mean is, we tend to nip action problems in the bud really quickly. If a kid has a technique, or they're just not doing something correctly, or even trying to do it correctly, we're usually pretty quick to latch onto that kid and fix it or do something about it. But on the other side, we tend to let behavior problems go for a pretty long time. And we just let those things fester until they become a much bigger problem and maybe even blow up our team, where we could have nipped it in the bud. We could have had that hard conversation when the player kept showing up late the first couple of times versus when that player shows up late before the big match or the big event. So we have to be careful that we don't let behavior issues go on long when we're so quick to act on action problems. So that moves us to, how do we make our culture functional? Like, it's great to talk about the philosophy and the pieces that go into it, but how do we actually work on that and make it what we want? And the key to that is, we have to learn, we have to create, we have to foster, we have to train, and we have to reflect. And what I mean by that is, we need to learn. So when we're in the social economics part, or that very, very base, and this is key, and the reason why this is the base of my pyramid is, this is where trust is built. And if we don't build trust, nothing we do will ever be as successful as it could be. We could still have success and we can still do well, but it'll never realize what it should be if we don't start with trust. And if we think about the people that we trust and why we trust them, like family members or really close friends, it's because we've gotten to know them. We spend a lot of time with them, and we just naturally learn about them and understand them and start to trust them. But yet when we have teams, even high school or college teams, where you may have players together for 4 years, we don't have a lot of time where we sit there and actually learn about them. We will do things like rope climbs and trust falls and all this stuff to kind of make this almost phony trust. But how many times have we sat down and really learned about those people, going beyond, hey, what's your name? What's your favorite snack? What's your favorite color? What's your number? How many times have we actually sat down and learned about everyone that's involved in our program? So one of the ways that we do that is we do bio sharing. And one of the things that my teams do every single year is they sit down and they write out their bio. Now, my players that stick with me, move on, they just add to their bio, change things, make it a little different year to year. But the very first practice that we have basically a bio hour where everyone reads their bio, talks about themselves. And it's amazing how that can change the culture and the attitude in the gym, because you may not know that the person next to you or the kid on your team is a single parent family, and they're struggling financially, and they have to come straight to practice after work. So they're stressed and they're tired every day. That changes how you can work with that player or that kid. Or we don't know that they're a military brat, so they're bouncing city to city year after year. We just don't know how hard of a life it's been, that they can't make roots and really become part of a culture anywhere. So this is what we put in the bio. Now, I'm not asking that they share their deepest, darkest secrets, but we want to know where they came from. How many brothers and sisters you have? What's your family life like? What do you like to do? What scares you? One of the big jokes around me, both as a coach and even my friends is I am like clinically scared to death of Bigfoot, Sasquatches. It's a legitimate fear for me. But I share that with everyone because it's funny, but then they also know something that not everyone knows about me. So we start to build that trust. Of course, I pay for it. I get random Sasquatch gifts in the mail or cards or jokes, but it's just a little fact that I probably wouldn't have just shared naturally, but it helps bridge that gap and earn that trust. Another thing that we look at is, do we have town halls? How many times do we meet with our parents and other stakeholders just to see how it's going? Usually we meet with parents for 3 reasons. They need to pay us money. They need to figure out travel and lodging for a big event. Or lastly, something big's happened. It's about to blow up the team and we have to fix it. But if we just had 30-minute town halls once a month, once every 2 weeks, just where we sat down and said, hey, this is how the training is going and this is what's going on and working for us. What are you guys seeing, as family? And just bounce ideas off. It doesn't have to be a complaint session or anything like that. It's just literally sitting around almost like a fire and talking about the program that everyone here is a stakeholder in. You as a coach are putting a lot of time and effort in. The players are putting a lot of sweat equity in. And obviously the parents are putting a lot of resources and time in, and your organization is. So all of them should have a voice. I'm not saying they should run your program. I'm not saying they should coach, but they do affect what's going on with your team. So they should have some sort of input, and you should hear from them on a regular basis. Maybe if you don't want to do bios, you can do video profiles where the kids record videos of their bios and make them fun and share them with the team or share them with the whole program so they start to get to know each other a little bit better. And then lastly, obviously, we need to really look at diversity, equity, and inclusion training. DEI training is huge. And it's great that we need to start looking at this because we're getting so many different populations and minorities into all these different sports. But we need to learn what comes with that. How can I help those players succeed? If I'm not willing to learn how to work with different cultures and diverse players, I'm never going to get the best out of them. I may get the best out of them athletically, but am I getting the best out of them as a person? And for me, that's what coaching always comes out for. I want my players to leave my programs as better citizens of the world than they came in. And I can't do that if I'm not willing to train and to learn and continue to learn different methods, different cultures, different things that I can do to help individuals play. Next, we go to the philosophies, and this is easy. We just have everyone create their philosophies. Every coach, every player, even parents should have a philosophy. And again, this is part of our opening day. We walk through what's important to you as a player. What is going to make your time with this team the best possible? What do you want out of this? What are the 5 key traits? Honesty, integrity, empathy, whatever it may be. Because at some point, those thoughts are going to be challenged. And if you have your philosophy out already, then how you can fix that or how you can work on that. If your number one priority, your number one philosophy and trait is trust, you'll know that in a conflict, no matter what the outcome may be for you, you have to side on the side of honesty. So that's kind of where we need to go. Most of us know basically we have that tingling or that sense of what our priorities are and what we like, but we never take the time to actually write it down. What happens when we have empathy and trust against each other? You're empathetic towards someone, but if you agree with them on a situation, it breaks trust with someone else. Which one is more important to you? Well, if we work that out, we at least have a roadmap on how we can work through that. And it's not just kind of going off of feelings. We know what we need to do. As coaches, when we have challenging players or challenging parents, if you work through your coaching philosophy, you'll know how to handle most of those situations. I'm not saying it's going to make them any easier, but at least you'll have the roadmap and you know what is important to you, and that's going to guide your decisions and your actions. And then lastly, everyone should know what their governing bodies stand for. What's the mission statement of USA Soccer? What's the mission statement of the NCAA? What's the mission statement of your school district, your high school? Because you want to make sure that you're coaching within those missions as well, because that will burn you out as a coach. If you're working for a program and their mission is to win, 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 and you as a coach, your philosophy is to grow the players, at some point you're going to have conflicts with administrations, and coaching is going to be tough. And then that's going to leak into your culture and affect your culture, because you're at conflict with different stakeholders and parties that are involved with your program. Environment. Working together is key with a culture. Now that seems common sense, but the problem is a lot of times we don't. We have a group, or maybe just a single coach, or, top-down administration that makes all the rules, and that's fine. But I think if you want to build a great culture, is give your team some ownership into your culture. Let them decide some of the policies. Let them decide some of the rules that the team's going to abide by. Now, obviously, there's some rules that are non-negotiable: drug policy, alcohol policy, things like that. But I'm talking about, why set a rule about what to do if a player's late? Let the team decide at the beginning of the year. Okay, these are the areas that we need to talk about. What are we going to do as a team if Joni shows up late every day? What that'll do is, one, it helps show commitment from the team, but it also gives them some ownership of the team. Okay, we get to make some of the rules. This is our team. It's not just me playing for my coach. We're all in this together. And then that continues to go into the goals, setting down and making goals, individual goals and team goals, and talking about them and how we're going to achieve them, instead of just going out, hey, we're going to try and win and be the best, and I'm going to grow you as players. Sit down and talk about active goals. I'm going to increase your hitting percentage by so much. We want to increase your speed by this much. We want to have a win percentage of, 600. Those are all things that you can sit down that help, again, start to build that trust, because the players, the parents, everyone will start to believe, like, we're all part of this together. So I trust that everyone's doing this in the best interest. We need to have a clear chain of command that, when stuff hits the wall or our backs are against the wall, we know who's going to make the final decision and what's going on. And this is how we're going to be, and it has to be respected. And then the biggest one for me from the environment is clear communication. A lot of times we're afraid to have the really hard conversations early and hope that problems won't arise later. And then they end up being a much bigger issue and a much bigger problem for us because we didn't address it earlier. We were afraid to have those conversations. We need to learn to start being comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. And that goes into more of when I work with strictly team culture. That's one of the big ones, is how do we deal with conflict? Because when sports are on the chopping block at a school, budget cuts or whatever, one of the very first things that people always say is, but sports teach us so much about life. They give us communication and they help us with conflict resolution, all this stuff, but we never train in it. We just hope that organically through playing sports, kids will learn how to solve conflicts. Kids will learn how to communicate, but that's not really how it works. We teach them how to do it. So how do we teach them how to resolve conflicts? And again, that's a whole nother topic that could take a week of us discussing, but that's something that you as a coach can look at, is how can I actually train these? And I hate using the term soft skills, but how do we train these soft skills in our athletes? Because we tout them that this is what sports produce, but very rarely do we actually teach it. Do we teach time management? Do we teach communication, conflict resolution, all those things? Or we just hope that they happen. And when we hope that they happen, that's when it seeps into our culture and changes things. When we don't learn how to have conflict resolution properly, then the conflicts start to shape and change the culture of our program. And we've now lost control over it. The big one for me, if I asked everyone in this group, what do you train or what do you coach? Most people would say, I coach baseball, I coach softball, I coach swimming. But the truth of the matter is, we don't coach a sport, we coach the people. We coach people regardless of whether we're coaching them in baseball, softball, volleyball, in the boardroom, whether we're training teachers. We are coaching and training people, not the sport. And too many times we forget about that. And we get so focused on the sports side, that's what starts to morph our culture and make things kind of go off. Does your training align with your philosophies? If you are, I'm a no punishment coach, I want to use positive reinforcement, but then I'm going to make kids do push-ups. Are you really training what you speak? So we want to make sure how our training reflects the culture that we want. If I'm saying that our culture is all of this, it's fun, it's exciting, it's fast-paced, it's honest, it's positive, but then when we get in the gym, it's slow, everyone's miserable. I'm telling one player one thing, and then I'm telling another player another thing just to keep them all happy. That isn't sticking by what our culture and what we're trying to, develop. So we want to make sure that our training also reflects it, not just the soft skills we're working on, but how we're actually training each drill, each skill. Does it affect the culture that we want? Am I going to let a kid swear when we're sitting around or we're on the bench? And I'm going to, call them out for it. But when we're in the heat of a game and the kid swears, I'm going to let it go. They've both done the same thing. It's just the situations are different, but are you going to let one go or are you going to punish it? And that's what we have to look at is how that affects our culture. We have to look in the mirror. We have to look and say, okay, where did it break down? Or what am I doing well? But to do that, we have to really look at it. Again, a lot of times, and I see it, I'm on all these forums in Facebook, all these different parent groups on Facebook, and I see it literally 5 times a day. What can we do for team bonding? These kids aren't getting along. No one's talking. They're fighting. It's falling apart. And the problem is we wait until it's that point instead of reflecting and saying, okay, I could see where this could be a problem. Let's address it now. Or maybe they misunderstood what I'm trying to say here. Let's change it. Too many times it's like paying the tax bill. We just put it off and put it off because we hope that no one remembers. And then every year on the 15th of April, we have to pay it. And we get upset and miserable about it, but we know it's coming every year. So we have to take the time and have those moments and actually look at our accountability and hold ourselves accountable for the culture. I'll be honest, it doesn't always work. We have programs. Probably this last year was one of the toughest culture years that I've had. And it was because I got complacent with where we were at, and we brought in a bunch of new players that were very diverse. And I thought that it would fit better, and I didn't really listen. Sure, when they came to me, I listened and we worked on things, but I wasn't actively listening and looking at the pulse of my culture and how I can work and change things. So when it comes down to cultures and why they usually break for 2 reasons. And we have toxic cultures. First is our unaligned philosophies. What I want as a coach is not what the team wants, is not what the player wants, is not what the parent wants, or isn't what the organization wants. And usually it's because we don't know. We never took the time to figure out exactly what everyone wants and what we need to work on. And that's a big one. We want to make sure that our philosophies align. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we have to be in lockstep with everything, but we need to at least know what they are so we know how we can work on it. Maybe you'll say, well, the club is making this a priority. It's not a priority for me, but we're going to work on it. But here are my priorities. But at least we know what the priorities are of the other stakeholders. The second one is poor communication. I talked about a little bit earlier about training our parents. A lot of times it's just because we're not telling people what they need to hear, or we're not doing it clearly, or they aren't receiving it the way that we're attending it. So one of the quick fixes, and one of the things that I love to do is after I have a quick conversation with a player, I ask them, okay, so what did we just talk about? What we learned? What's the goal of what we just discussed? I need to make sure that they're on the same page as me. They may not agree with it, and that's fine. We can work that out, but at least we know we're talking about the same thing. But a lot of times it's just poor communication. And honestly, all you have to do is go into any sports parent group on Facebook, and you can see that's the problem. A lot of parents are just confused. They don't know why decisions are being made. They're not necessarily upset about the decisions. They're more upset they just don't know why. And it's because we have this saying, oh, we can't talk about playing time, or don't talk to the coach for 48 hours. And that just doesn't work. If we take the time and have the communication, have the conversations. Now, there's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be parents and players, administrations, even assistant coaches that are a pain in your butt. But at least you know that you have the communication happening. All right. So as we start to wrap this up, I'll give you what's the plan in a nutshell. So we talked about all these components and these issues. So what's the plan that we can do to start to create this functional philosophy? Step one, have your players, coaches, stakeholders. That's parents, administration, anyone you think that's going to have direct effect on your team. Create personal bios to share. I think it's great when parents share what they do, what they came from. Well, I wasn't a volleyball player, but I was a baseball player in high school, because that can help you down the long run. When you're talking with a parent about their player, maybe you can relate it more to baseball so they understand it. But if you don't take the time to know those parents, you'll never know if you can use it. So have a night maybe where you go through all the bios of the parents, have a fun team meal or team dinner where that's what you do. You share those bios. Create coaches, player, and team philosophies. You as a coach every year sit down and what is your coaching philosophy? And if you go to my website, there's a link that has resources, and you can see what my current coaching philosophy is for an outline, just to kind of look at it. There's some tips on my website on how to create one, but make the players and then the team as a whole think about what's important to them. What do they value and how they're going to work on it? 3 is gather the vision and mission statements for your governing bodies and organization. Make sure everyone involved with your team knows what your governing bodies and organizations expect or what they're about. Pop Warner is a little bit different than Babe Ruth, which is different than Little League, which is different than USA Volleyball, which is different than USA Soccer. So gather and see what's important to those groups. Ensure that your rules, your policies, and your goals fit those philosophies that you've talked about. Make sure your training fits those philosophies, and then also just schedule regular meetings, huddles, and just talk about the culture. Don't worry about, hey, these are the X's and O's problems. Have those meetings where you're talking about, okay, what's going on and kind of what's the problem. So that's the functional, culture in a nutshell. And it's different than what we talk about when we talk about team culture. Team culture, we talk about communication and trust and accountability and results. But before we even get to that point, we have to make sure what the culture is completely around us and what we're doing there. So I will now pass it back to you, Saxon, and we can do some questions and whatever we need to do.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And great presentation. A lot of amazing content for these coaches. The first is actually around that. Coach Corbin asked if we would be able to distribute the PowerPoint to the RSVPs.
Yeah, I will. I'll send it over to you in an email, and then you can post it with the link, and everyone can download it.
Great. And Coach asked, does feed forward hamper creativity? How about catching them doing right, or is it a balancing act?
It is a balancing act. I don't think of it as killing creativity, because I don't always say this is exactly how I want you to do it. A lot of times I will say, okay, this is the result that I want, and then let them go. But sometimes we just don't give them enough information to even tell them what we want, let alone doing specific X's and O's on it. But yeah, it certainly is a balancing back, because I want my team members to have some individuality. I want them to have some of that artistic situations. I want it to be more of an art form than just a sport form for them. So it is a little bit of a balancing act.
Great. And then the next one was, I love the idea of bios for parents and athletes. Have you had success getting it from them, since they're usually very busy?
Yeah. What I found is we need to make it important. It may not seem like a very important thing to you, especially when maybe you're starting your season, you have a million things to do. But when I was coaching club, it's a little bit different with college, because I can force them to do it a little bit easier. But in club, we just wouldn't practice, or I'd say, okay, we're not doing it until I have these. And once parents and stakeholders realized how serious you were about it, they started to come around and get them. But again, that's one of those things where it's going to take you a little bit to build it and figure it out.
Awesome. And then Monica is asking about culture shifts. So new hire is establishing a new culture with their individual group. Head coach coaches to their own style with their group. Overall team culture needs to shift. Any advice?
Yeah. So Monica, I think what you need to do is really look at what is the most important culture. Like ultimately, what do you need to establish? And then you have to figure out how you're going to work everyone else in, the players, the assistant coaches, and start to put your own style. And I get it. It can be really tough when you come in. I once came in mid-season for a replacement, and my culture was very different. So what I did was I figured out what was the most important piece or pieces and start there. So if I had, 5 areas that I think were really important to me culture-wise, I would start with one and just work that until that piece fit, and then move on to the next one, instead of trying to just kind of blow it up and start with a whole new culture.
Great, thank you. And then Ryan asked, how does one create a coaching philosophy when there's so much you want to include, but not sure how to articulate it in a few sentences?
Ryan, I'm glad you asked this, and I can give you the quick version. You write down, just sit down with a piece of paper and write down a single word for everything that's important to you: trust, communication, empathy, everything. And then you cross off the ones that aren't the most important, and you just continue to rank it until you get your top 5. Once you get your top 5, then you expand it from a word and make it a sentence. This is what empathy means to me as a coach. And this is what trust means to me as a coach. And you write out the sentence or a couple sentences. And then the last step is you just then put those 5 together to make it a living document. And if you look at mine, you can see that how it's done. You can see that I got down to my 5, and then I expanded the definition of those 5 and what they mean to me as a coach and how it pertains to the culture of the team, and expand it and made it, kind of like a living document.
Great. And then Samantha asked, at the high school level, if a player is unhappy about playing time or upset about a situation, do you think it's beneficial to have one-on-one conversations with players first before having parents in the meeting?
I will put a little bit of a caveat on my answer, which is yes. And that is, you have to gauge whether or not it's going to be productive. And this is actually an issue that I have a huge problem with on the coaching side. Normally I stand arm in arm with our coaches. But this is one that I struggle with, because being a parent and watching it now from this side as well, I realize that our kids aren't learning how to have these conversations. So when we're forcing a kid to talk to their coach about playing time, it usually doesn't go well, because typically the kid doesn't know how to have that conversation. And it's not just about the playing time. It's just, they don't know how to interact with an authority figure, and how to have that communication. So one of the things that I work on when we do the team culture piece is, mining for conflicts. We look for little things that we have conflicts over and learn how to resolve them, learn how to have those conversations. So I think it is beneficial if the coach has that one-on-one, but the coach needs to realize pretty quickly whether or not it's going to be beneficial. And if it isn't, maybe like, hey, I get it. Let's bring your parents in and let's talk about this. I think we're forcing a little bit too much on the kids, thinking that, because these kids are so smart and they do all this stuff on social media, and, the classes that kids are taking in high school now are far beyond what we took in high school. We think that they're very mature with all this. And to be honest with you, social anxiety and anxiety in general in the youth population is off the chart, even pre-COVID. And we add COVID into it now, it's like literally off the chart. So we're putting them in another situation that probably wouldn't be beneficial if they're not used to it yet. So to try and gauge, maybe, work on having those conversations about other things so they get comfortable talking to you before you have to have that one-on-one about playing time.
That's a great answer. Let's see. Elizabeth said that her parents are interested in attending their competitions. How can she show them the importance of it?
You know, that's tough. Some parents don't, and I get it. Some parents literally are probably paying just for glorified babysitters for their kids, drop them off, go out to eat and have some time alone. And I think the way that we show the importance is through the kid, just making sure that the kid is happy and the kid talks about what a great experience it is and what it means to have them. I don't know that as a coach, there's much that you can do that's going to convince them that their own child can't. So I think my process would work more with the child and the player, and have that player, learn to express to the parents what it would mean to have them there. I think that's probably the easiest way to go on that situation, is not directly to the parent, but just boost the kid up. And once they see their kid being so happy, maybe they'll be like, you know what, I do need to be there for him because this does mean a lot to him.
The next question is from Kendall, and they asked, we are mid-season. What would be your number one recommendation to get on a successful culture track? Coaches, athletes, parents, or all?
This one's easy for me. For me, 100%, it is the philosophies. What does everyone want? What are the expectations? What's the expectations of all the coaches? What's the expectations of the athletes? And what's the expectation of the parents? And then from there, you can figure out how those pieces all work. But it kind of goes back to that. What do you do, especially in high school, you kind of get the kids that you get in high school. What do you do if you have a roster of 12 and 6 of them, this is their sole focus in life, they're all in, and the other 6 are, this is my second sport and I'm just doing it to stay in shape. So it's, how can we cater to those kids as well and still push the team as a whole to be an excellent team? When I was a high school coach, I ran into a lot. We would get a lot of football players come out for volleyball because they weren't playing baseball or something else in the spring. And a lot of times they're like, well, football this, football that. And I would just have to show them, like, well, this is what makes it important. And this is why you're important to this team. This is what you bring. And once they saw kind of their role was, okay, this might be my second sport, but I have an important role in this team, they put a little bit more effort in. So I think really, Kendall, looking at what is important, and the philosophies that everyone involved is where you should start, and then build around that and figure out some stuff you may have to change, some stuff you may add in that you weren't thinking about. So it's kind of a meshing of that. Are we still good? I think I got one more from Danny. I'm a Christian and a pastor. I find the principles contained in the Bible an excellent example of set team culture on my players, both on and off court. Would you agree that principles are a good model to follow? I think anything that is a good example role model can be used. Obviously, it depends, how much of that you're going to use if you're in a Christian school setting versus a non-Christian. That's really you're gonna have to look at that part of the culture. But I think anything that's going to be a good example and anything that you can incorporate into your culture philosophy is for the good.
Awesome. Sorry about that. I was stuck on mute. But
no problem.
Awesome. I think that was the last question we received. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, if anyone has any additional questions or wants to reach out to Dan individually, all of his contact information is in the slides that I'm going to be distributing, as well as in the comments just a little further up. So any additional questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to take those personally as well, if you're more comfortable doing so. Well, a big thank you to everyone else who is on the call. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join this, and an extra big thank you to Coach Mickle for being on today's call. With that, we will wrap it up.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It was great. And yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions or anything you want to chat with. I love to hear from people.
So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.